For the latest news and updates on Tibet, subscribe to Yarloon YouTube channel. And don't forget to click the notification bell icon.
I want to start off by saying and emphasizing that there is hope. There's always hope, and we must not lose hope because there's strength in oneness of our humanity. And just look at the people inside of Tibet. Look at the people inside of East Turkestan continuously rising. And so with that, I want to begin with that. So when we look at just COVID-19 in general, my colleagues have done a wonderful job in setting the stage in terms of the order and the way it has happened and unfolded both in China and across the world. And if I may add to it, from the beginning, we saw that because of the lack of accountability on China's front, hiding the truth about COVID, that led to millions of deaths. However, we also saw that amidst the pandemic, while the world was struggling to keep up with it, China weaponized the pandemic to their benefit. China moved quickly to create exports, PPE, ventilators, medical supplies, whatnot, all of it to benefit themselves. And we saw the rollout of various tactics, and one was vaccine diplomacy. We saw how they would only engage in various types of donations that was directly linked with their foreign policy initiatives and their interests. We saw that in Nicaragua, be it Ukraine, but all of it comes with a cost. Of course, as does every type of business with China, because there's always some sort of strings attached when it comes to dealing with China. That was the first. Second, the propaganda. It's pretty obvious. Amongst the Tibetan people, wherever we are protesting, we often say, China lies, people die. Specifically, the lives of Tibetans who live under the Chinese colonial rule, very substandard services, whether it is the treatment of the society in a social perspective or a political perspective. And the propaganda continues, as my colleagues have already mentioned, until last week. The reports were constantly talking one thing, but then you'll see other reports completely reporting the opposite. So, as Vijay had mentioned, the deaths number of 5,241 since the pandemic had begun in 2019 has completely changed and shifted to nowadays recent numbers saying about 60,000 deaths linked to COVID, especially since after lifting the restrictions. And so it's pretty obvious that no information is completely clear when it comes out of China. And it doesn't help when there is an information blackout where, of course, world journalists, any type of agencies, aid agencies, international world organizations are not able to have access. Forget about Tibet, let alone even China. Number three, the tactic is the response to the pandemic. So a lot of the international world seems to always turn a blind eye to the Tibetan voices, the Uyghur voices, when we talk about the human rights violations by the CCP. Why is that? It's because oftentimes countries are putting money prior to human rights, profit before people. And that's because of the increasing impact and effect of Chinese economy in the global world, right? And we saw that in the pandemic as well. Despite the fact that China had hidden all the truths, there was a time when the whole world's GDPs were decreasing, China sees, although a very small amount, but still saw one of the very few increases across the world in China. However, I want to emphasize that it's actually a double-edged sword. Because of the pandemic, China was not able to see a lot of their initially envisioned leadership in terms of the world stage. China was hoping that in 2020, that was going to be the year for Chinese leadership to celebrate the doubling of its economy over a single decade. However, we saw that didn't happen. And in fact, the increase in their GDP, which is about 2.2 to 6%, was actually the slowest annual rate increase that they'd seen since Mao Zedong. So that emphasis on the double-edged sword In addition to that, let's look at the Belt and Road Initiative. There has been a huge roadblock. The pandemic has played a roadblock for the Belt and Road Initiatives, where they see a reframing of that Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, any initiative is not possible when there's no shaking hands happening with other nations. So all of these other nations that have chosen to shake hands with China not only have blood on their hands, but it's not actually as beneficial for them as they thought. Now, with 3 years of lockdown, mass testing, forced quarantines, we've seen an uproar. We see the fragility of Xi Jinping's leadership. And in our Tibetan Buddhist sayings, we say that all phenomena are impermanent, which makes me come to the point of hope. The situation inside of Tibet has always been terrible and has continuously worsened since 2008. The colonial rule of Tibet, has not only the typical story that you hear about the terrible situations inside of Tibet, but there are different ways of how its colonial rule has been impacting the Tibetan lives, from, as I said earlier, substandard social services, external political control, social destructiveness in a local level. So in the name of poverty alleviation and development, all we have as Tibetans have seen and have experienced with lived is just lies and many deaths. The situation inside of Tibet is so bad that we've been hearing about recently the report that came out just a year ago about the colonial state-run boarding schools. The trauma and the ridiculous history that North Americans carry of residential schools is being repeated right now as we speak, where children as young as 4 years old are being stripped away from their parents for 5 days a week so that the Chinese government can completely brainwash and take away and uproot the Tibetan identity from the former next generations to come. We also heard about the forceful DNA collection and blood sampling of Tibetans. Over 1.2 million Tibetans have been forced to give away their blood and DNA samples so that China could build their largest DNA bank system in the world. So, in addition to all of the existing challenges as a Tibetan, during the pandemic, we also saw all of these inequities just further amplified for a Tibetan living inside of Tibet. Just recently, we've been seeing videos of crematoriums. There's lack of space. The amount of deaths are rising in the Tibetan areas, as is in various parts of China. However, in parts of Tibet, I heard this Tibetan person telling us that there's no absolute chances that they're able to get access to vaccines. And even if they did, there are phony vaccines that, the Chinese officials, they themselves are getting vaccinated with the vaccines that are internationally recognized, but then to the general public are not being accessed to. So all of these deaths are continuously happening. We've been hearing about monasteries, monks not being able to tend to all of the needs of the society because of the tremendous amount of rises in debts. So where does this leave me? I want to go back to the point of hope. I know, Doné, you said that, since 1989, we saw the largest sort of dissent against China. I would disagree, because inside of Tibet, the dissent against China has always been there. Tibetans have been continuously rising left, right, and center. Since 2008, we saw massive uprisings. 2012, the pushback has always been there from Tibetans against the Chinese rule. Protests have risen even in the exile community in all across the world, especially with the revolution, the A4 revolution. We saw protests from Tokyo, Melbourne, New York, Taipei, and in Europe alone, we saw demonstrations all across London, Paris, Rome, Berlin, Budapest, and I could go on. And the people were shouting the same slogans, asking Xi Jinping to step down, whether it was in the streets of Beijing or Shanghai to the rest of the world. For me, I was joining fellow Chinese citizens whom I would have never imagined being alongside, not folks that are pro-democracy, but rather Chinese citizens who actually, one of them came during a protest and said to me, "Hey, I love my country. I've never seen anything wrong that the Chinese government did until recently. And now I'm starting to see that I was fed lies. Can you tell me the story of Tibet? And this person is a regular Chinese student, an international Chinese student, who really honestly came up to me and asked that question of, can you share about Tibet? So with that experience, and not just that, right? We've been seeing in protests all across. A friend of mine was at Columbia University, where there was protests being held in solidarity with the A4 revolution. And when they saw her Tibetan flag, they started shouting the slogans of Free Tibet. And these are Chinese citizens across the world that are screaming Free Tibet. So if that's not hope for a better future and a better world, I don't know what is. Despite the lockdown, despite the long-arm tactics and intimidation tactics that the Chinese government uses outside of China, these Chinese students are rising. So I think there's definitely hope, but also it's not something that we can blind ourselves with the reality of this, not only the situation inside of Tibet, Uyghur regions of East Turkestan, and also China. It's something that we must constantly be aware and on top of in terms of the reality. In terms of erasure of the Tibetan people, it's happening from every pillar of the Tibetan identity, from whether it is our religion, our walk of life, education, or uprooting the next generation. So what is our role? What is our role in terms of the international community? It is to be wary and always be ready to slash the misinformation, to not just debunk what the propaganda says, but also capture the nuance of how the regime constantly avoids any sort of accountability and responsibility, whether it is for the deaths of COVID or the constant lies that they're feeding, an infiltration of the West's understanding of left and progressive ideas. Recently, we also saw with pandemic how the Chinese government flipped the idea of anti-CCP sentiments to being anti-Asian sentiments, right? These are double-edged swords for the Chinese government, but it's also harming us in many ways. And so it's important that we recognize the ways that it harms our narratives and how we play into feeding into the ideas of the Chinese regime. And first and foremost, why are we calling East Turkestan Xinjiang? This is the narrative that Chinese government is feeding. And you'll see that actually various parts of India has also been renamed in various Chinese names. And it is important as part of the international community that we do not feed into the narrative that the Chinese government is constantly selling. We must constantly be battling against it and providing an alternative for the rest of the world, especially as experts and panelists and whatnot from the Human Rights Society. That's the least that we can do, is to not ascribe to the narrative of the Chinese government and also equip the rest of the world to be able to provide the reality, the truth, and have agency for the communities that are directly affected. So another nuance to be captured again is the A4 revolution, right? Now blaming the A4 revolution as a scapegoat for the amounts of deaths right now, the opening up of China. We all know that the opening up of China is not necessarily just because of the A4 revolution and the uprisings. The uprisings, even if I were to credit a lot of the protests for the slowing down of Xi Jinping or the release, the sort of letting go of the zero COVID policy, we'd be naive to think that it was merely the protests. It's really, economic powers and the way that the economic decline was happening. It was kind of clear that China was going to head towards that direction anyways. And when it did, now it has an excuse of letting go Chinese citizens that are positive in flights all across the world. And we saw these positive cases upon landing. Flights are having 30 to 40 positive cases of Chinese citizens coming from China, flying into various countries, including Europe and North America. And so what are we going to do as part of the international community in order to constantly be battling against not only the narrative of the Chinese government, but also in support and solidarity of the communities that are affected? I don't think we have time to wait for answers by the Chinese government. It's time that we have the answers of how we can move towards a better world. And there's always going to be hope, because when we look at the people that are directly affected inside of Tibet, inside of East Turkestan, and constantly how that they're rising despite the oppression, the just horrendous situation inside of their respective countries, and also Chinese citizens rising, the question again lies on us about what are we going to do to stand in solidarity. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.